My name is Nadia Reeves, and I am 36 years old, and I am sitting in the living room of my apartment in Nashville, Tennessee, on a Sunday afternoon in February, with rain hitting the windows in the specific way that February rain hits windows in Nashville, which is sideways and persistent, and without any of the romantic quality that rain in songs and movies has, just cold and horizontal and relentless. And I am going to tell you a story that I have been carrying inside me for 4 years. A story that began with a text message from a woman I had never met, and that became the most unexpected and the most transformative relationship of my adult life. A relationship that I could not have predicted, and that I would not trade for anything, not for the easier version of my life, where Daniel Marsh never said what he said to me, and where I never had to sit with the specific weight of being told by someone you loved that you were too damaged to be loved back, not for any version of my story that didn't include the Tuesday evening in October, when Daniel looked across the restaurant table where we had had our first date, and where he had ordered the same thing he always ordered, and where the candles were the same candles they always had, and where everything was ordinary, except the expression on his face, which was the express of a man who has made a decision and who is delivering it with the specific, careful gentleness of someone who believes that gentleness in the delivery is the same as kindness in the act. And he said, in a voice that was warm and regretful and entirely certain, that he cared about me very much, but that he had been doing a lot of thinking, and that what he had concluded was that he was not able to be what I needed. Because I was, he said, too damaged, too full of the things that had happened to me before him, too weighted down by a history that he had tried to understand and engage with, and that he found, ultimately, more than he was equipped to carry. And he wanted me to know that this was not a reflection of my worth as a person. He actually said that, not a reflection of your worth as a person, as if worth and lovability were separable, as if a person could be valuable and still be too much for love, as if the things that had happened to me and that had shaped me, and that were as much a part of me as my name or my face or the sound of my laugh, were something I was carrying in a bag that I could put down if someone asked me to, rather than the actual architecture of my interior life. And I sat with this assessment for 2 years. I carried it around with me the way you carry something heavy that you have been told belongs to you, not questioning whose it actually was, not examining the person who had handed it to you and what their handing it to you said about them rather than about you, just carrying it, letting it shape the way I moved through the world, letting it make me smaller and more careful and less willing to take up space in the lives of people I was beginning to care about. And then on a Thursday evening in March, 2 years later, I received a text message from a woman named Cara Ellis that said, very simply, very directly, in the specific economy of words that people use when they are afraid of taking up too much space, but who have decided that what they need to say is worth the risk of taking up space, she said, "Hi, my name is Cara. I think we both know the same person. And I think he said the same things to both of us, and I was wondering if you would be willing to talk." And I looked at that text message for a very long time, long enough for my tea to go cold and for the television I had on in the background to cycle through 2 episodes of something I was not watching. And I thought about Daniel, and I thought about the restaurant table, and I thought about the 2 years I had spent carrying the assessment he had given me of my own lovability. And then I typed back, very simply, very directly, "Tell me everything he said to you." And what followed from that exchange was a conversation and then a friendship. And then something that I do not have an adequate word for. Something that was more than friendship and different from friendship. The specific connection that forms between two people who have been harmed by the same thing, and who recognize in each other the shape of the harm, and who decide, together and without a template, and without any established social script for what they are doing, to heal it together. And this is the story of that healing, and of the 2 women who did it, and of the man who inadvertently created the conditions for them to find each other. And I want to tell it from the very beginning, because the beginning is where I was still whole, in the way that people are whole before they have been told that they are broken. And understanding that wholeness is the only way to understand what the breaking cost and what the rebuilding required, and what it produced that the original wholeness could never have contained. I grew up in Memphis, Tennessee, the middle child of 3 daughters born to Robert and Patricia Reeves, who were both teachers, my father, a high school history teacher, and my mother a middle school English teacher. And growing up in a household where both parents were educators meant growing up in a household where words were taken seriously, where language was understood as something that had weight and consequence and that could build things and break things depending on how it was used. And this understanding of language as consequential is something I absorbed so early and so completely that it became part of how I moved through the world. The specific attention to words that a person raised by English teachers has, the awareness that what people say and how they say it reveals things about them that they may not intend to reveal, that the choice of a word is never accidental, that the structure of a sentence carries meaning beyond its surface content, and this attention to language would eventually become both my profession and my survival skill. Would be the thing that allowed me to eventually hear what Daniel had said to me not as truth, but as information. Not as an accurate description of my nature, but as a revelation of his limitations, would be the thing that helped me understand that too damaged to love was not a diagnosis but a deflection, not an observation but a defense, not something he knew about me, but something he needed to believe about me in order to justify a decision he had already made, for reasons that had nothing to do with damage and everything to do with his own specific, unexamined fears about intimacy and vulnerability and the specific cost of loving someone who has survived difficult things and who therefore knows, better than most people, what love actually requires as opposed to what it performs. My older sister, Rachel, was 3 years older than me, and my younger sister, Lily, was 4 years younger, and we grew up in a house full of books and dinner table conversations, and the specific warmth of a fun family in which ideas were treated as things worth arguing about, where disagreement was not a disruption, but a form of engagement, where you were expected to have opinions and to support them and to revise them when presented with better evidence. And this intellectual environment gave me certain things that I am enormously grateful for, and also certain things that complicated my life in ways I only understood much later. Among them, the specific vulnerability of a person who has been taught to examine everything, and who therefore cannot stop examining herself, who turns the analytical attention inward with the same rigor she applies outward, and who finds, inevitably, more material than is comfortable to find, more complexity than is comfortable to sit with, more evidence of the ways she has been shaped by things that were not her choice than is comfortable to acknowledge. The things that had shaped me, the things that Daniel would eventually describe as damage, began when I was 9 years old with my parents' divorce, which was not dramatic, not violent, not the kind of divorce that announces itself in broken dishes and raised voices, but the quiet, devastating kind that announces itself in the specific silence that settles over a house when two peoples have stopped fighting and started simply coexisting, when the arguments that at least had the quality of engagement have been replaced by the particular emptiness of two people who have nothing left to say to each other and who are waiting for the right moment to say that they have nothing left to say. My father moved out in November of the year I was 9 and moved into an apartment that I visited on alternating weekends and that smelled different from the house I grew up in. Not bad, but different. The specific unfamiliarity of a place that belongs to someone else, even when that someone else is your father. And I navigated the divorce the way middle children navigate difficult family situations, which is by becoming the person who manages everyone else's feelings, who makes sure Rachel's grief is acknowledged, and Lily's confusion is addressed, and my mother's exhaustion is not increased by 3 daughters needing more than she currently has to give, and the managing of other people's feelings is excellent training for certain kinds of adult competence, and terrible training for certain kinds of adult relationship. Because the person who has always managed other people's feelings eventually forgets that their own feelings are also entitled to management, forgets that their own emotional needs are not less important than other people's, just because they are better at keeping them quiet. The second thing that shaped me was a relationship in college with a man named Aaron, who was charismatic and brilliant, and who loved me with a specific, consuming intensity that felt, in the beginning, like the answer to every question about whether I was lovable that my parents' divorce had raised, the specific relief of being wanted completely and without reservation, and who gradually, almost imperceptibly, over the course of 3 years, converted that intensity from something that was about his love for me into something that was about his need to manage me, who turned from a person who loved who I was into a person who loved a specific, managed version of who I was, a version he had helped create through the slow, patient work of suggesting and implying and gently correcting until the woman he was in a relationship with was the woman he had constructed, rather than the woman who had walked into the relationship. And I did not recognize this process while it was happening, because I was 20 years old and I was in love, and I did not yet have the language or the experience to name what was happening to me. And by the time I had the language, the relationship was over, ended by Aaron with the specific, contained certainty of a person's who has gotten what he needed from a situation and who is moving on to the next situation. And I emerged from it with a certain knowledge of what intimate control looks like and a certain difficulty trusting the evidence of my own perceptions that would take years of work to address. The third thing, the thing that Daniel would have called the heaviest piece of the damage, was my mother's illness. She was diagnosed with early onset Alzheimer's when I was 28, and she was 56, diagnosed at an age that made the diagnosis feel like a category error, like a clerical mistake that would be corrected when someone looked at the files more carefully. And it was not a mistake, and it was not corrected. And the years that followed were the years of watching my mother, the woman who had given me language and had taught me that words had weight, slowly and inexorably lose her access to language, lose the words that had been her tool and her identity, and her primary means of connection with the world. And with the 3 daughters she had raised, and I want to tell you about what it is like to watch that happen, because I think it is important for this story, and because I think the people who have watched it know exactly what I am describing. And the people who haven't need to understand it in order to understand what Daniel was calling damage, what he was dismissing as too heavy to carry, what he was using as the justification for his exit from a relationship that required him to be present with someone who had looked at something very hard and who had not looked away. Watching my mother lose her words was the most educational and the most devastating experience of my life. Educational because it taught me, in ways that could not be taught abstractly, what it means to love someone through a loss that is ongoing and cumulative, and that has no resolution, what it means to show up every day for a person who is deceived and who needs you to see them even as they become increasingly difficult to see, to find the person inside the diminishment and to maintain your connection to that person, even when the connection requires more imagination and more patience and more love than you knew you had available. Devastating because it was my mother, because she was 56, because the woman who had taught me the weight of words was losing the words, because every visit to the care facility where she lived in the last years of her illness required Holden to hold simultaneously the person she had been and the person she currently was, and the gap between two people which was growing, and which I could not close, and which I visited and visited because the visiting was the only thing I could do, and because not visiting would have been a betrayal of something I did not have a word for, but that was central to who I was. That was central to who I was. I was in the middle of my mother's illness when I met Daniel. I was 31 and she had been diagnosed for 3 years, and I was 3 years into the specific exhausting project of being a daughter to someone who was losing herself. 3 years into the twice-weekly visits to the care facility and the phone calls with Rachel and Lily about medication and care plans and insurance and the grinding administrative machinery of serious illness. And I was also 3 years into my career as a writer and editor for a regional magazine, where I had built a reputation for the kind of personal essay that requires its author to look at difficult things directly and to render them in language that is honest without being self-pitying. And the writing was the thing that kept me sane during those years, kept me in relationship with language, and therefore in relationship with myself, kept me from drowning in the grief of watching my mother disappear by giving me a way to make the watching into something that might be useful to someone else. I met Daniel at a reading, a literary event at a bookstore in Nashville, where I had been invited to read an essay about my mother's illness that had been published in the magazine, and that had generated more reader response than anything I had written before, the specific reader response that happens when writing about a difficult subject lands accurately. When people write to say they have been there too, they have felt this too, they thought they were alone in it, and now they understand they are not. And after the reading, a man approached me at the signing table who was tall and dark-haired, and who said, with the direct, unornamented quality that I always find more compelling than practiced charm, I read your essay 3 times before tonight. My father has the same diagnosis. I wanted to thank you for writing it. And I looked at him and I thought, this is a person who understands something that most people I know don't understand, the specific texture of this particular grief. And that shared understanding was the beginning of everything. Was the ground from which the relationship grew. Was the thing that made me trust him faster than I might otherwise have trusted him, because I believed that a person who had sat inside this particular experience of loss was person whose emotional capacity was sufficient for the kind of relationship I needed. And this belief was the specific understandable mistake of a woman who confused the experience of difficulty with the capacity for intimacy, who confused having been in the presence of hard things with being willing to stay in the presence of hard things, who confused Daniel's ability to articulate his own grief with his ability to hold someone else's. We dated for 14 months. The 14 months had a quality that I want to describe accurately because it is important for understanding what happened at the end of them and what the ending said about both of us. The first 6 months were the best 6 months of any relationship I had been in. The specific expansive quality of a relationship with someone who sees you clearly and who engages with what they see, with genuine curiosity and genuine warmth, who asks questions about the things that matter to you, and who listens to the answers, and who shares their own interior life, with the specific courage of someone who has decided that vulnerability is worth the risk. And Daniel was all of these things in the first 6 months, was present and interested and willing to be known, and I gave him the same presence and interest and willingness. And the exchange between us felt like something real and growing and strong. The change began, I think, around the 8-month mark, though I cannot pinpoint the specific moment because changes of this kind do not announce themselves. They reveal themselves retrospectively. You look back from the other side, and you can trace the shift. But while you are inside it, you experience it as a series of small, individually explicable moments rather than as the coherent pattern that it actually is. What I noticed first was that Daniel became quieter about his father. Not that he stopped talking about him entirely, but that the conversations about his father's illness became shorter and less specific, that the willingness to go into the difficult details of what the illness looked like and what it required from him emotionally Makai, that had characterized our early conversations was replaced by a kind of surface management, a tendency to report rather than to explore, to say things were hard without saying what hard felt like. And I noticed this and I asked about it, and Daniel said he was fine. He was managing. It was what it was. And I heard the closing in the response. But I did not press it because I had spent enough years in my family being the person who didn't press because pressing increased the load on people who were already carrying too much, and I defaulted to not pressing out of the specific, deeply practiced consideration of a woman who has always managed her needs around other people's capacity. What I did not understand at the time, what I understand now with the clarity that distance provides, is that Daniel was not closing because he was overwhelmed by his father's illness. He was closing because the relationship itself had begun to feel overwhelming to him. Because the specific weight of being in a relationship with a woman who was also managing a parent's serious illness had started to feel like more than he had signed up for, and the closing was the beginning of his exit, the specific gradual withdrawal of a man who has decided that he is going to leave, but who has not yet found the framing that allows him to leave in a way that feels justified to himself. And what he was looking for, I understand now, was a justification. And the justification he settled on was my damage, was the history I carried, was the things that had shaped me, was the specific weight of a life that had included difficulty, and he dressed the justification in the language of care, of not being able to be what I needed, of caring about me too much to continue in a relationship that he was not equipped to sustain. And the dressing was convincing enough I wore it for 2 years without fully examining what was underneath it. The night he ended the relationship I want to tell you about in specific detail because the details matter, and because I have gone over them many times in the years since, and because the going over has eventually produced, through the alchemy of time and therapy, and the specific illuminating friendship that I am about to describe, a clarity about what was actually happening that I did not have in the moment, and that I want to share, because I think it is the kind of clarity that is useful to people who are inside similar situations and who do not yet have the distance to see what they will eventually see. He had suggested we go to the restaurant where we had our first date, which, in retrospect, was a specific choice, a choice that was about ending something in the place where it began, closing the circle in a way that gave the ending a kind of symmetry that I think Daniel needed for his own sense of the narrative, because Daniel was someone who needed his narratives to have a certain shape, who could not tolerate the shapelessness of a relationship that simply dissolved, who required an occasion, a setting, a form. We ordered and we ate, and the conversation had the specific quality of a conversation in which one person knows what is coming and is waiting for the right moment, and the other person can feel that something is coming but cannot identify what it is. And the not knowing is worse than knowing in the specific way that anticipatory anxiety is worse than the thing being anticipated. And I sat across from Daniel in that restaurant feeling the approach of something, without being able to name it, and being unable to ask directly. Because asking would have required me to acknowledge the feeling, and acknowledging the feeling felt. In that moment, like an invitation to the thing I was afraid of, he put down his fork and he looked at me and he said, "Nadia, I've been thinking about us." And I said, "Okay." And he said that he cared about me very much, and that what we had was real, and that he didn't want me to feel that what he was about to say was a reflection of my worth as a person, because it wasn't, it was a reflection of his limitations. And even as he was saying this, I was hearing the specific rhetorical structure of a person who is about to say something unkind, and who is preloading it with the disclaimer that makes the unkind thing feel like a gift. The "I'm saying this because I care" structure that is the framing device of every person who is doing something hurtful and who needs to believe, as they do it, that the doing of it is actually a form of love. He said I was too damaged. He said it in more words than those two. But those were the words. That was the content. That I was carrying more than he was equipped to handle. That my history, the divorce, the relationship with Aaron, my mother's illness, was a weight that was pulling us both down, and that he cared about me enough to be honest, rather than to continue in a relationship that he did not think was serving either of us. I sat with this for a moment. I sat with the specific terrible experience of hearing someone use the word damaged about you, hearing someone take the things that had happened to you, and the ways those things had shaped you, and the work you had done to understand those things, and to live inside them with as much grace as you could manage, and to render them in language that other people found useful and true, and to compress all of that into a single word that was both a dismissal and a verdict: damaged, as if I were a product that had arrived from the factory with a flaw. As if the things that had happened to me were defects rather than experiences. As if surviving them had made me less rather than more. And I sat with all of this, and I did not say any of it because I was in a restaurant and because I was in shock. And because the thing about hearing someone tell you that you are too much to love is that it lands on the specific frequency of every other time in your life that you have believed you were too much. Every time your parents' divorce made you feel that the family had fallen apart around something you were or weren't. Every time Aaron's management of you made you feel that who you naturally were required correction. Every moment of being the strong one, the managing one, the one who held everyone else together, that had produced in you the specific cumulative doubt about whether you were the kind of person who was allowed to have needs. And Daniel's words landed on all of that frequency at once, and what I said, very quietly and very steadily, was, "Okay, I understand." And I put my napkin on the table, and I picked up my purse, and I left the restaurant, and I sat in my car in the parking lot for 20 minutes. And then I drove home and I took off the dress I had worn to the restaurant, and I put on the oldest, softest sweater I owned, and I made tea, and I sat in my living room, and I let myself understand that it was over. The 2 years after Daniel are the years I want to describe carefully, because they are the years that are most important for understanding where I was when Kara's text arrived, and what that text meant and what it made possible. The 2 years after Daniel were not dramatic years. There was no breakdown, no crisis, no visible falling apart. I went to work and I wrote my essays and I visited my mother. And I spent time with Rachel and Lily, and I maintained the surface of my life with the specific competence of a woman who has always maintained surfaces and who knows how to keep the inside from showing through. What was happening inside was quieter and more insidious than a breakdown, was the slow, steady work of a verdict being internalized, of too damaged to love becoming part of the vocabulary I used to describe myself to myself, of the self-assessment that I conducted in the private language of my own interior becoming organized, around the question of whether Daniel had been right, whether the damage was real and the assessment was accurate, and whether the appropriate response to that accuracy was to adjust my expectations of what was available to me rather than to examine the accuracy of the assessment itself. I went to therapy. I want to say that clearly because therapy was important and because I do not want to minimize its role in the years between Daniel and Kara, the role of my therapist, whose name was Dr. Sarah Kim, and who was a small, precise woman with a remarkable ability to sit inside difficult things without flinching, and who asked me questions that required me to think rather than just to feel, and who never, not once in 2 years of working with her, used the word damaged in relation to me without immediately following it with the question of who had defined damage and what their definition served. Dr. Kim gave me many things over 2 years of weekly sessions, but the most important thing she gave me was the beginning of the understanding that the language other people use to describe us is information about them, rather than truth about us. That the word damaged, applied by Daniel to the things that had shaped me, was a word that revealed something specific about Daniel's relationship to difficulty and complexity, and the specific work of loving someone who has a history, and that what it revealed was not that I was unlovable, but that he was unwilling to do the work that loving someone with a history requires, and that the unwillingness was not a verdict on me, but a limitation in him that he was dressing in the language of my inadequacy, because dressing it that way made his exit feel like an act of care, rather than an act of self-protection. I was in the middle of beginning to understand this when Kara's text arrived. I want to tell you about the text again, because the first time I described it, I was describing it from inside the story, and now I want to describe it from slightly outside, from the perspective of what I know now about what Kara was feeling when she sent it, and what it cost her to send it, and what she was hoping I would say. Kara Ellis was 29 years old when she texted me. She was an interior designer who had grown up in Atlanta and who had moved to Nashville 3 years earlier for a job opportunity, and who had met Daniel 8 months before she texted me at a gallery opening, where they had talked for 2 hours about a painting they both found beautiful, and who had entered the relationship with him with the specific, open-hearted willingness of a woman who had not yet had her openness used against her, who had not yet learned that some people interpret openness as an invitation to enter and assess rather than to connect and stay, who had given Daniel access to the full complexity of her interior life, because that is what she did, what she was built for, and who had received in return the same focused, present, curious engagement that he had given me in the beginning, the same quality of being seen and interested in and engaged with that is, when you experience it from someone whose attention you value, one of the most powerful and most destabilizing things available to a person in a relationship. She had been with him for 6 months when the text arrived. 6 months of what she described to me later as the best relationship she had ever been in, the most connected she had ever felt with another person, the most fully herself she had ever been allowed to be. And also, she said this quietly, and with the specific honesty of someone who is being accurate rather than self-critical, the most anxious, the most unsettled, the most aware of a quality in the relationship that she could not name, but that felt like the ground shifting slightly beneath her feet. The specific anxiety of a person who is being loved in a way that is slightly too focused, slightly too managed, slightly too organized around a version of her that she can see being constructed but cannot find the language to resist. She had found my name by looking through Daniel's emails. She had not done this snooping. She did not characterize it as snooping. She characterized it as responding to the specific anxiety she had been feeling. The anxiety that tells a person that the information they have is incomplete, and that the incompleteness is intentional. And she had found a folder of emails from me, from the period of our relationship, and she had read enough of them to understand that I had existed, and that the relationship had been significant, and she had found, in the most recent emails, the exchange that had accompanied the end of our relationship, the exchange in which I had asked Daniel to tell me clearly what had ended, and in which he had told me, in email, things that were similar in content and structure to what he had said at the restaurant, and she had read those emails, and she had felt the specific recognition of a person who is reading something that applies to her own situation, even though it was written about a different situation. And she had found my name in the magazine where I published my essays, and she had read the essays and she had found contact information. And she had sat with the text she was going to send for 3 days before she sent it, had written it and deleted it, and rewritten it and sat with it, and finally, on a Thursday evening in March, had pressed send. I texted her back within 10 minutes. I said, "Tell me everything he said to you." And she started with a voice message because she said she needed to hear herself say it rather than to write it. And what she said in that first voice message was the beginning of the most honest conversation I had had with another person, since the conversations I had had with Dr. Kim was the beginning of something that was going to change the way I understood myself and the way I understood damage and the way I understood love and the way I understood what it means when someone tells you that you are too much for love to hold. I called her back. Not texted, called, because the voice message had a quality in it that required a voice in return, the specific human quality of sound that carries things that text cannot carry, the tremor that indicates something is being held together with effort, the pace that reveals the speaker is choosing their words carefully. And Kara's voice had both of those things, and I understood that she needed to be heard rather than read, and I called her, and she answered on the second ring. And we talked for 3 hours on that first Thursday evening, talked in the way that two people talk when they have both been carrying something heavy and have suddenly found someone else who has been carrying the same weight, and the relief of the shared carrying produces a kind of honesty that is usually only available after years of trust rather than in the first conversation. She told me what he had said. He had not said too damaged to her. He had said too complicated. He had said she was too much, too complicated, too full of needs and history, and the specific weight of a person who felt things deeply, and who expected the people around her to be able to hold the depth, and the difference between too damaged and too complicated was, Kara said, the difference between a screwdriver and a hammer. Both tools for the same purpose, both delivering the same message in slightly different language. The message that the fullness of who she was the problem, and that the solution to the problem was her absence. I listened to everything she said, and then I said, "How long ago did he say this?" She said, 3 weeks ago. I said, "And you're still living with it?" She said, "I can't stop hearing it." I said, "I know. I heard the same thing 2 years ago in different words, and I spent 2 years trying to figure out if he was right." She said, "Was he?" I said, "No, and neither is Daniel. But understanding that intellectually is a completely different thing from feeling it, and the feeling takes longer." She said, "How much longer?" I said, "Different for everyone, but having someone to talk to about it helps." She said, "Is that an offer?" I said, "Yes," and that was the beginning. What Kara and I built over the months that followed was something that I could not have designed, and that I could not have predicted, and that I want to describe as fully and as honestly as I can. Because I think there is something in it that is useful, something beyond our specific situation, something about what happens when two people decide to be completely honest with each other's, about the experience of having been told that they were too much, and about what that telling did to them, and about the work of undoing what it did. We talked every Thursday evening. This became our practice, the specific rhythm of the weekly conversation that gave us both something to look forward to and something to prepare for, a container for the things we were thinking about and working through during the other 6 days of the week. The conversations began, in the early months, primarily about Daniel, about the specific things he had said, and the specific ways those things had landed, and the specific work of understanding what they meant, and what they didn't mean, and what they revealed about him, and what they had revealed. In the hearing of them, about us. Kara was analytical in the way that people who work with space and form and the organization of the visual world are analytical, able to see the structure of a situation and to describe it precisely. And this precision was something I valued enormously, because I am also someone who finds that comfort in precise language, in the naming of things, in the specific vocabulary that makes the intangible tangible and the overwhelming manageable. And our conversations had a quality of collaborative analysis that was also deeply personal, that moved between the intellectual examination of what had happened and the emotional experience of having lived through it, and the movement between those two registers was itself healing, was the specific healing that comes from being able to think about your pain rather than only to feel it, to apply language to the experience, and thereby to gain, gradually, some degree of relationship with the experience rather than being simply inside it. I want to tell you about a specific Thursday evening in June, about 3 months into our regular conversations. Because it was the evening that something shifted between us, that the conversations became something different from what they had been. Something that went beyond the processing of Daniel and his words and his limitations, into something more fundamental and more lasting. Kara had been quiet for a few minutes in the middle of our conversation, the specific quiet of someone who is deciding whether to say something they have been thinking about, and then she said, "Can I ask you something that might be strange?" I said, "Strange is fine." She said, "Do you think there's some things that made us both attractive to him specifically? Like, do you think he seeks out people who are who we are? People who have histories and feelings and depth, and then uses those things as the justification for leaving?" I sat with this for a moment. I had thought about it but had not articulated it clearly, and Kara's articulation of it made it suddenly more specific and more important than it had been in my own unspoken thinking. I said, "Yes, I think exactly that. I think people like Daniel are drawn to depth and complexities, and the specific texture of someone who has lived inside difficult things, and who has come out of them having learned something. Because that texture is attractive. It has a quality that is compelling. It suggests a person who is real rather than performed. And I think that what Daniel specifically cannot do is stay with the thing he is drawn to, because the depth requires him to bring his own depth and he doesn't have it. Or he has it and he is afraid of it. And when the requirement for reciprocal depth becomes clear, he exits. And he needs an explanation for the exit that is about the other person rather than about himself. Because explaining the exit as his own limitation would require him to look at himself in ways he is not willing to look. Kara was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That's the clearest thing anyone has said to me since this started." I said, "It's clearer because I had 2 years to get there." She said, "Will you help me get there faster?" I said, "That's what we're doing." The months continued, summer in Nashville and then fall, and Kara and I continued our Thursday conversations, and they continued to evolve, continued to move beyond Daniel and into the larger territory of what we each understood about ourselves and what we wanted and what we were afraid of and what we had learned from being told we were too much and what we were going to do with the learning. Kara was working through her own history, the specific history that Daniel had called complicated, and that she was learning to understand not as complication but as depth, not as a burden but as the specific richness of a woman who has paid attention to her own life and who has not looked away from the hard parts, and who has therefore accumulated a knowledge of human experience that is worth something. That is in fact one of the most valuable things a person can have, and the work of reframing that history from liability to asset was slow and not linear, and required the specific patience of someone who understands that reframing is not a single act but a practice. Something you do repeatedly and imperfectly until the new frame is as familiar as the old one. I was doing the same work in parallel, was using the conversations with Kara as a mirror and a catalyst, was finding in her experience of what Daniel had said the specific illumination of my own experience that is only available when you can see the same thing happening to someone else, when the pattern that was invisible, when you were inside it becomes visible because you can see it happening from outside. And the visibility was clarifying in ways that months of therapy had begun, and that the friendship with Kara was completing. The specific completion of understanding that is only available through the combination of professional guidance and genuine human connection. The understanding that lives in the head and the understanding that lives in the body coming together in the specific integration that makes change not just intellectually grasped, but emotionally inhabited. In October, 7 months after the first text, Kara told me she was ready to start dating again. She said it on a Thursday evening with the specific mix of excitement and fear that readiness always contains, and she said, "I'm not sure I know how to be in a relationship without managing myself, without making myself smaller to fit what someone else needs." And I said, "I know. That's the work. The work is learning to take up the full space of yourself in a relationship and to find someone who is not threatened by the full space, but who is enlarged by it, who finds in the fullness of you not a burden but a resource." She said, "How do you know when you've found that?" I said, "I think you know the same way you know anything true, which is that it doesn't require you to talk yourself into it. It just is. It has a quality of obviousness that the wrong things never have." She said, "Have you started dating again?" I said, "Not yet." She said, "Why not?" I said, "Because I'm still finishing the work." She said, "What's left?" And I thought about this honestly, thought about what was left. And what I said was, I think I'm still working on believing that the fullness of who I am is the offering rather than the obstacle. I understand it in my head. I'm working on feeling it. She said, "I think you're closer than you think." I said, "I think you might be right." It was in November, 10 months after the first text, and a year after Dr. Kim had said to me, for the first time, that the language other people use to describe us is information about them rather than truth about us, that I had an experience that I want to tell you about. Because it is the experience that completed something that had been in process for 2 years, and that I had not been able to complete alone, and that Kara's friendship had made possible. I was at a reading, a literary event at the same bookstore where I had met Daniel, and I was reading an essay I had written about my mother, not the essay I had read before. A new one, written from the perspective of 2 years further along in the illness and in my own understanding of what the illness had required from me and what it had given me. And the essay was honest in the way that my essays always tried to be honest, was specific and direct, and willing to name the hard things without softening them. And I read it to an audience that was quiet in the way that audiences are quiet, when they are listening with their full attention. When the reading is the only thing in the room, and when I finished, there was the specific moment of silence that comes before applause when something has landed. And then the applause, and then the questions, and one of the questions came from a man in the third row, who said, very simply, "How do you write about something that hard without losing yourself in it?" And I said, without thinking, without the hesitation that would have characterized my answer to that question 2 years earlier, when the word damaged was still living inside me as a verdict rather than as information. I said, "Because the hard things are part of who I am, and who I am is what I have to write from." The hardness isn't separate from the writing. It is the writing. It's the reason anyone reads anything honest, because they recognize in it the texture of a life that has been actually lived, not performed. And the texture is only available if you go into the hard places and come back with what you found. And as I said it, I understood that I had finished something, that the thing Daniel had called damage was the thing I was describing as the source of everything worth reading, worth knowing, worth building a life from, and that the two descriptions, damage and source, could not coexist as equally true, and that the one I was choosing was the one that was mine. I called Kara after the reading. It was late, and she was already in bed, but she answered because we had established long ago that calls after 9 were allowed if they were important, and I told her what had happened and what I had said and what I had understood in the saying of it. And she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Nadia, I need to tell you something." I said, "Tell me." She said, "I've been trying to figure out how to say this for a while, and I'm just going to say it directly. You are the person who helped me understand that I was not too complicated to be loved. You are the person who sat with me every Thursday for 10 months and helped me rebuild the thing that Daniel took apart. And I want you to know that the reason I was able to do that, the reason the conversations worked, is not because you were some sort of healed person who had all the answers. It's because you were willing to be honest about still being in the work, about still carrying things, about still figuring it out. And that honesty was more useful to me than any amount of arrived certainty would have been. And I think you need to hear that what Daniel called damage is what made you able to help me, is what made you someone worth knowing, is what makes your writing true, is what makes you someone who other people want to be around. And that a man who saw all of that and called it damage was a man who was afraid of the thing he was dismissing, and who chose to dismiss it rather than to be changed by it. I sat with this for a long time. I sat with it the way I had sat with Daniel's words at the restaurant, with the specific, still attention of someone who is receiving information that is going to matter, that is going to stay with them and become part of how they understand things. And I said, "Thank you," she said. "I mean every word." I said, "I know you do. That's what makes it land." 6 months after that phone call, I started dating again. Not because I had decided it was time in some programmatic sense, but because I had met someone, a man named Julian, who taught environmental science at Vanderbilt, and who had come to a reading I did for a conference on environmental writing, and who had asked me afterward, with the specific directness that I have always found more appealing than practiced charm, whether I would be willing to have coffee, because he had been trying to write about his own fieldwork and had not been able to find the language for it, and he thought I might know something about language that would help him. And I said yes because the directness was appealing, and because the request was honest, and because I was, for the first time in years, genuinely curious about what would happen rather than afraid of it. I told Julian about my mother on the second date because she was the most important person in my life, and because anyone who was going to be in my life needed to know about her. And Julian listened with the specific, present listening of someone who is not waiting for you to finish so they can respond, but who is actually taking in what you are saying and letting it land. And when I finished, he said, "That sounds incredibly hard and incredibly important. Thank you for trusting me with it." And he did not follow this with any indication that hard and important were more than he was equipped to handle. He simply received it and moved forward, and we had dinner for 2 more hours, and he made me laugh twice. And I thought about Kara and about what she had said about knowing the right thing, because it doesn't require you to talk yourself into it. And I thought, yes, this has that quality. This has the quality of something that is simply true, rather than something that requires argument. I told Kara about Julian on the Thursday after the second date. She was quiet for a moment and then she said, "How does he make you feel?" I said, "Like who I am is interesting rather than complicated." She said, "That's it, that's the one." She was not exactly right, in the sense that Julian and I have had our difficulties and our hard conversations and our moments of genuine uncertainty, but she was right in the essential way. In the way that the essential things are right before the details are worked out. And Julian and I have been together for 2 years now. And the relationship has the specific quality that I would not have been able to name before Kara and before Dr. Kim, and before the work of the years after Daniel, the quality of two people who are complete in themselves and who choose each other daily, and for whom the choosing is easy, not because there are no difficulties, but because the foundation is real, is made of actual material rather than performance. And the actual material is, in part, the things that happened to me, the things Daniel called damage, the things that are the texture of my life and the source of my writing, and the reason Kara called me, and the reason Julian found me interesting. And I want to say clearly and without equivocation that the damage was not damage. That what Daniel named with that word was the specific richness of a woman who has paid attention to her own life and who has not looked away, and who has brought back from the places she has looked the specific knowledge that is only available to someone who has been there. And that knowledge is not a liability. It is not a weight. It is not something that makes love more difficult. It is the thing that makes love real, that makes it more than performance, that gives it the specific gravity of something that has been chosen by someone who knows what they are choosing and why it matters. I want to tell you about where Kara is now because Kara's story is part of this story, and her story deserves to be told in full. Kara spent the year after our conversations rebuilding herself with the specific patient attention of someone who understands that rebuilding is not a project with a completion date, but a practice with a direction. And she threw herself into her work with an intensity that produced some of the most beautiful design projects she had ever done. Spaces that had the quality of her full self in them, that were not managed or contained but genuinely expressive of someone who understood that beauty requires the fullness of the person making it, not a managed version, not a careful version, but the real one. And the work was recognized in ways that changed her professional trajectory, that moved her from someone who was good at her work to someone whose work was talked about, whose aesthetic vision was specific and compelling and worth seeking out. She started dating again 14 months after our first conversation. She told me about him, a man named Marcus who was a contractor she had worked with on a project, and who had impressed her not with charm but with the specific, uncomplicated honesty of someone who says what they mean and means what they say, and who had asked her to dinner by saying, very simply, "I find you interesting, and I would like to spend more time with you." And Kara had looked at me through the phone. I could hear her looking at me, and she had said, "He said interesting, not complicated, not too much. Interesting." And I had said, "That's the one," and I was right. Marcus and Kara have been together for a year and a half. And the relationship has the quality that both of us were working toward. The quality of two people who are not managing each other, but who are genuinely meeting each other. And watching Kara be in that relationship has been one of the most satisfying things I have witnessed. The specific satisfaction of watching someone who was told they were too much discover that the right person finds the too much to be the most interesting thing about them. We still talk on Thursday evenings. Not always about Daniel, rarely about Daniel now, mostly about our lives, our work, our relationships, the ordinary and the extraordinary, the full range of what two people who have become genuinely important to each other talk about. Over the course of a friendship that has settled into something permanent, we have met in person twice. Once when Kara came to Nashville for a conference, and once when I went to Atlanta for a reading, and we spent a weekend in her city, and the in-person meetings had the specific quality of meetings between people who have known each other very well through words, and who are discovering that the words were accurate, that the person in 3 dimensions is exactly the person that the voice and the text had suggested. And there was no adjustment required, no gap between the imagined and the actual, just the simple, enormous pleasure of being in the same room as someone who knows you well and who finds what they know worth knowing. I want to say something about Daniel before I end this story, because I think it is important, and because I have been telling this story primarily from inside my own experience and Kara's experience, and I want to acknowledge that Daniel is also a person in this story. Not a villain, not a monster, not someone whose damage should be described with the same dismissive word he used to describe ours, but a person who is limited in a specific way and who has not yet, as far as I know, done the work of understanding his limitations, who is probably in a relationship with someone right now, and who is probably doing the same things he did with me and with Kara. Not because he is cruel, but because he has not been required to examine himself clearly enough to see the pattern. And I feel something toward him that is not quite compassion, and not quite indifference, but is somewhere between them. The specific position of someone who has been harmed by a person, and who has processed the harm far enough to be able to see the person as a person, rather than as the harm, to understand that the word he used about me was a word that revealed something about his own limitations that he has not yet been willing to look at, and that, I hope, for the sake of the people he will encounter, he eventually does. And I want to say something about the word itself, about damaged, because the word is the thing. The word is what the story is about. The word is what Kara and I spent months unpacking and examining and turning over and holding up to the light to see what was inside it, and what we found inside it. What we discovered through the slow and patient work of 2 women who had been told that their histories made them too heavy for love was this. The word damage describes something that was whole and has been broken, and that therefore lacks something it previously had, something that is missing from it. And what Daniel and people like Daniel apply this word to, what they are actually describing when they use it, is not the absence of something but the presence of something. Not a missing wholeness but an accumulated depth, and the depth is not damage. The depth is the specific richness that comes from a life that has been actually lived, that has included loss and difficulty and the hard work of surviving and understanding those things. And the richness is not a burden. It is not a weight. It is not something that makes love more costly. It is the thing that makes love real, that gives it the specific weight of something that has been chosen by someone who knows what choice costs and who chooses anyway. And that choosing, that daily, deliberate, eyes-open choosing is not damage. It is the opposite of damage. It is what makes everything worth anything. It is what Kara and I found in each other, and what we have both found in the lives we are building, and what I want anyone to hear who has ever been told by someone they loved that the fullness of who they are is the problem, that the history they carry is too heavy for love to hold, that the depth of their interior life is too complicated for the simplicity that the person saying it requires. You are not too much. You have never been too much. The person who told you that you were too much was telling you something about what they were unable to carry. And what they were unable to carry was not your damage. It was their own. My name is Nadia Reeves. I am 36 years old. A man told me I was too damaged to love, and his next girlfriend called me and I answered, and what followed was the most important friendship of my life, and the most important work of my life, the beginning of a life that is fuller and more honest and more genuinely mine than anything that came before it. The rain is still hitting the windows sideways. My tea is cold. Julian is in the next room reading, his feet up on the couch, completely at home in my space the way the right person is completely at home in your space, not managing it, not diminishing it, just present in it. And I am here, at my desk, telling this story, because I believe it is worth telling, and because I think there are people who need to hear it, and because the telling of it is itself a form of the thing I have been learning, the willingness to take up the full space of myself without apology, to offer the full complexity of what I know and what I have lived and what I have built from what was done to me without softening it for anyone's comfort, including my own. I am not damaged. I am deep, and the difference is everything.